Hi everyone, my name is Amelia. As Yuki said, I'm a PhD candidate or pre-candidate with the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning up on the main Parkville campus. And today I'm going to be talking about my research project, which looks at how local governments are scaling up environmental initiatives to higher levels of policy and in particular to the global agenda. But you don't need to understand all that yet. We'll get into that in a bit more detail. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Alright, let's get into it. So, this is the agenda for today. These are also the three topics that inform my research thesis. So we'll be going through them one at a time, starting with sustainability science. I'll give a brief overview of global urban studies before moving to multi-level governance, which is sort of the conceptual framework for my thesis. And this is where the research question sits. So how are city governments scaling up environmental initiatives? And we'll get to the research questions at the end. So I thought we've got a conference on sustainable development. Maybe we should start by defining it. So sustainable development was first defined in the Brundtland Report in 1987, which defined it as development that meets the needs of current and future generations. Now that was a really good start to define sustainable development, but that definition has been heavily critiqued since for failing to acknowledge that humans don't exist without the Earth system. So for my thesis, I draw on this definition of sustainable development by Griggs et al., which says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system, which the welfare of current and future generations depends. So you can see here that there are three pillars or spheres of sustainability that sit underneath this definition, recognising that sustainable development requires social sustainability or the people sphere, economic sustainability or the prosperity sphere, and planetary sustainability or environmental sustainability. That's where my research focuses. So I'm looking at environmental sustainability for my thesis, recognising that we must conserve natural resources and protect global ecosystems to support the health and well-being of our society. Now, I've pointed out this global aspect very intentionally because my research looks at global development frameworks. So these big colourful boxes on the screen, can I get a hands of who recognises them? Okay, that's good, great. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals. They were adopted in 2015 by the UN as the sort of overarching framework to direct sustainable development to 2030. So there are 17 goals which range from topics like poverty to reduced inequalities to climate action and peace and everything in between. Now these goals are just kind of the top of the cake. Underneath we have 169 targets and 232 indicators. So it's an incredibly comprehensive framework and fairly ambitious. The idea is we meet all of these goals by 2030 and hey presto, we'll have a sustainable world. I also want to acknowledge that I've included a few other frameworks underneath here, the Convention for Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. These are more specific frameworks and they do address things like biodiversity and climate change. But it was recognised that the SDGs is such a broad framework as the overarching umbrella under which these other frameworks sit. I also want to draw your attention to one very special goal, SDG 11, or the urban goal. So this is really important because the inclusion of SDG 11 was the first time at the UN level that cities were recognised as central to sustainable development. Let's explore why. So, currently, more than half of the world live in cities. 55% of the human population reside in urban areas. Yet, urban areas, the building footprint, only takes up 3% of the Earth's surface. But we do recognise that the ecological impact that cities have extends well beyond that 3%. This has led to an increasing recognition that urban areas are an issue, an environmental problem. They're places where a lot of environmental problems are concentrated. So think about flooding issues, you think about heat, you think about biodiversity loss, pollution, waste. There are a lot of environmental issues. On a global scale, they have quite a significant impact. So remember, just over half of the population on 3% of the Earth's surface, yet city or urban dwellers, that's you and me, we contribute to 70% of the global economy, 75% of global energy consumption, 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and 70% of global waste. So, in a nutshell, the urban issue is fairly significant and of global relevance, which leads us to the inclusion of this goal of 11. But when we reframe these environmental problems through the SDGs, we see that cities also present opportunities for environmental solutions. So BioOur recognises that the collective actions of cities will determine whether the world, and I would say also how the world, moves towards sustainability. And what you see on the screen here is just an SDG mapping exercise. It's very high level, but I've just indicated that cities are not only responsible for goal 11, but also for 4 other goals, from economic growth to resource consumption. I also want to point out, though, that city governments, these are the local authorities responsible for managing how a city functions, actually address aspects of all 17 goals. So these are just a couple of examples. And because we've only got 10 minutes, I'm just going to focus on one. So, Betzel and Bulkley recognise that the local, being the city, is an important site for governing global environmental problems. What you see here is one of the targets within SDG 11, target 11.6, which looks at reducing the environmental impact of cities. Here's why. So these are some pictures of the plastic waste issue in a city in Vanuatu. I'd like to credit Alexi Trundle for these images. Thank you, Alexi. So you can see here that plastic waste is a big issue that is of local and global concern. So local governments are, for the most part, responsible for dealing with a lot of the plastic waste. So think about who collects your bins every week. The local government's responsible for managing that. So, but you can see here the magnitude of the waste, which is not just concentrated to Vanuatu, is significant. This is Australia's plastic waste problem. So a few years ago, we used to ship our plastic waste offshore to China. A few years ago, China said, no thanks, we don't want your waste anymore, it's your problem. This is what happened. And for the most part, local governments are the ones responsible for dealing with a lot of the waste that we see, that we produce as urban residents. So increasingly, city governments are in these kind of pressure cookers. You've got a lot of issues in a very concentrated space. You've got climate change impacts making things hotter and wetter and more dangerous. You've got growing populations, meaning that space is really contested. So city governments, being the ones, on the most part, on the ground trying to deal with these issues, are becoming agents of change. So just a quick recap of where we've been. So we've got city governments at the bottom here, responsible for managing environmental issues such as waste initiatives. At the global level, you've got United Nations. Now, the United Nations is a body of national governments. It's basically United National Governments. They're responsible for setting the global agenda for managing a lot of these issues. In between these two levels, we have a whole range of other actors. And I want to pay special attention to national governments. Even though they are members of the United Nations, national governments themselves are also the governing body domestically. So they have a huge influence on how much local or city governments can do. So they control things like policy and funding. So these are very significant actors in this global ecosystem of actors influencing how sustainable development is defined and then implemented. One way that city governments are becoming these agents of change is they're working with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we saw on the previous slide, waste management directly relevant to target 11.6 in goal 11. Also very relevant to goal 12, which is sustainable resource consumption. So a lot of city governments are starting to work with these global goals, recognising that if they link local issues to a global agenda, they might unlock some more funding. There is a lot of research documenting this growing movement of local governments working with goals like the SDGs, but also the Paris Agreement, so setting climate targets. What my research is more interested in is how these local initiatives, the things that city governments do really well, are influencing the global policy agenda. So how are local governments scaling up action? And I'm looking at this through a multi-level governance framework, recognising that if we're going to achieve these 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, we're going to need collaboration, communication and engagement between all levels of government and society. It's pretty ambitious. My thesis is kind of testing what is the role of local governments in all of this. So, the research question is, how are local governments scaling up environmental initiatives? Within this, I'll be investigating the key linkages between different actors, so what are the key relationships between the various actors? How do these relationships or linkages influence vertical scaling up of local initiatives to other higher levels of government? And finally, and importantly, what are successful mechanisms for local governments to vertically integrate or scale up action? Thank you very much.